What's up there, Workforce? Chris here with Work to Game, and we are here in part 2 where we talk about combat. I just did an intro. I'll keep posting sections of this, and then I'll post one big complete one at the end for anybody that just wants to see the whole thing. So let's dive into combat. So combat in Temtem is basically the center of the game. Whether you're playing the game to collect or you're playing it for combat itself, it is the thing that you're gonna have trouble avoiding. It's what you have the most of your time spent doing outside of walking simulator to and from areas where you're doing combat. It's important to understand how it works, and if you've never played a game like this, it can be a lot to learn. And if you have played a game like this, probably Pokemon, there's just enough difference that you should kind of let's learn some terms to make sure that you're not getting anything slightly confused or misunderstanding something so you have the best chance of success. I'm basically going to focus mostly on lingo here, and we're going to focus on each stat of what things are and how they work, and then that way when we take a brief overview of combat itself at the very end, it should all be very straightforward once you see how they're getting their numbers and how this system works. So when we open up a TEM, we go to squad, we open up details, we go to our little chest, we open up details. All of these screens are going to be the details screen or in the Tempedia page as far as in-game stuff. The first thing you're going to note on a TEM is its types. It has 1 or 2 types up at the top. I haven't seen any 3 types. It doesn't mean they couldn't add them, since at the time of this recording we only have half of the intended TEMs. I assume it'll all stay with 2. Every type has strengths and advantages. It's fairly straightforward when you look at the chart until you start to factor for 2 type TEMs. 2 type TEMs, you basically you add on to it. So if something's strong against it, if you have a electric type ability and it's hitting a water type TEM, it's going to do double damage instead of single damage. If instead it was a type that didn't do well against water, it would drop to half damage. So very similar to Pokemon, just don't trust that all of your typing chart is going to line up with exactly the way you remember. These types function just a little bit differently because they did have to try to make their own thing. So when you have 2 types, this is where it gets intriguing. If the technique is good against both types, it's going to go from 2 times to 4 times, quadruple damage. This can one-shot a TEM, and it can really tear things up. But on the other side of that coin, if it is weak against both types, it will drop from half damage to a quarter damage, which even if you are the bigger, badder TEM, way more leveled, perfect statted, you are still going to feel like you just barely touched them if you are getting quarter damage. And so you may wonder what these abilities are. They're called techniques. And so this is where your damage is going to come from. Every round you can select a technique if you're not selecting to either rest that turn so that you gain back some stamina, switch to another TEM, or use an item, or run, I guess. So the first thing to note when you open up an ability is going to be the stamina cost. That means that these are not bound by PP. They can theoretically be used an infinite number of times as long as you have the stamina. Now, should stamina ever go negative, should you have 10 stamina left and use a 15 stamina ability, you will use that ability, and then you will pay for the extra stamina you used by doing what's called overexerting. That extra 5 stamina in that example will take off 10 life, so that HP will be burned at a rate of 2 to 1. So if you go over by 30 stamina, you can really wreck your own health, and then you will be forced to rest for a turn because you've overexerted. During that turn, you can still swap, you can still use items, but you have overexerted, so you simply cannot use stamina that turn. You gain 3 stamina around, so really cheap abilities can feel even closer to infinite because you just feel like your stamina is never kicking down. And the next thing to note is that there can be bars next to the ability name. The ability name is in the color to kind of give you a clue of what type it is, and these bars are going to tell you about a hold. That means it can't be used until the TEM has been out that many turns. And so these can be up to 3, but you can see why as you pick which 4 to put on your TEM, you might not want to put all hold 1s, 2s, and 3s, because then you won't have anything to do on turn 1 unless you have some other plan on using an item or using a Tem that makes it to where it removes holds or something like that, you're going to have a plan on why you're going to do that, or you're just going to be letting them hit you and you can't respond until those holds come off. Now, techniques can range from everything from attacks to modifying stats, and the tooltip largely explains them. They've got 3 little types up in the corner. You've got your regular attacks, which is the empty star, your special attacks, which is the filled in shiny star, and then you've got your status altering ones, so things that don't really do damage, so things like putting them to sleep, reducing their speed, something like that. And so that's most of what a technique is. The last thing is that a handful of techniques in the top left will have a little cross symbol, and that shows that they have a synergy. So when you open them up, they'll have the base ability, and then they'll have a secondary thing next to it that says, hey, if these conditions are met, it will do something bonus. And those conditions are determined by who is out with that Tem. So that Tem has a dance partner here. They have another Tem alongside them, since you always have 2 out at the same time. And it might say if that other Tem is a fire type, it's going to do bonus damage and all of this. So you can kind of think about that when you're looking at your team and saying, who should I have out with who? And you may not only think about your team as 6 good Tems, but you may think about them as who they can pair with and who works with who, so you can trigger those synergies. And if you're not going to trigger the synergies, you may want to think about, is that still the best ability to put on there, since you can swap abilities anytime you're not in battle. You can go back and swap those. The abilities that you have learned are basically every Tem, every evolutionary line, so that may just be the one Tem, or it can evolve. I've seen them evolve up to 2 times so far. They share a set of techniques that they learn at specific levels. And then in addition to that, you have these courses so that you can teach them techniques. And then in addition to that, breeding can actually give you access to a little bit more. And so you may want to choose those based on kind of what is the best set of abilities within reference to your team as a whole. Now, techniques can target a single target. They can target more than one. They could be whole other teams. So when you talk about things like lightning, it actually targets a certain number of people in a certain order, and that order is determined at the time the ability goes off. So if a Tem is knocked out between you picking that ability and them using that ability, who you originally targeted may shift. Lightning can actually come back and even hit your own team members. So I have knocked out my own Tem because one of them overexerted, knocked itself out. Mine came back around and hit my own guy and hit it for 4 times damage. So just be really careful with that. It takes some getting used to, especially on ones like lightning, but you should be fine as long as you read your tool tips. The game will try to show you who it's targeting and if it's going to take out health, but it won't confirm window to say, hey, do you really want to hurt yourself? It will just let you hurt yourself. If the target is not available, it will still use the stamina. So if both of theirs get knocked out by your first Tem, the second Tem will still swing, use their stamina, and will just miss. If its original target is gone, it will just move to the second target. So when you have 2 Tems really weak and you want to catch them both because they're out in the wild, and one is in the red and one's in the orange, throw both your cards at the red. That way, if the first card catches the red, the second card will shift over the orange, that's great. If the first card doesn't catch the red, that second card will remain on target for the red. So just kind of think about how combat can play out when you think about the order of things. Now, from there, we need to look at the 7 stats, so we understand kind of what these techniques are targeting and how the numbers on these techniques are being determined how much damage they do. The top stat is going to be your health, and that's going to be how much damage can be done to you before you're knocked out. The only way to be revived is with an item or going to one of the healing stations, talking to somebody that heals your Tems, etc. And if all your Tems get knocked out, that's how you ultimately get ported back. It's going to charge you a little bit of a fine for basically dying. The next is stamina. That's the mana for all the techniques we were just talking about. Now, I'm going to go a little out of order here, but basically you have attack and special attack. So I noted that that's what's determined by the little star and the little shining star and all that, but that basically attack and special attack are 2 different stats, so they're going to affect different abilities. And so you may find that one Tem you put all special attacks on, so really special attack's the only one that matters there. Defense and special defense are the other side of that, and they're helping you reduce the amount of damage coming in from those types of attacks. And so if they hit you with a special attack, then your special defense is going to be what's triggered. Now the last one here is speed. The reason I talk about that last is because that's going to factor in with priority. The one little thing that I didn't mention on techniques here, because it doesn't make sense without speed, is these little arrows over here. It can range from ultra low to ultra high, I think is what they're called. But basically, the more little arrows, the better. And this is going to be multiplied by a Tem speed to determine what order things happen. So if you've ever played D&D, you're used to kind of determining initiative. That's what's happening here. Theoretically, they say an ultra fast could happen so fast that you can't even swap the Tem before it would go off. I've never seen this happen. I just see it written out there on the elusive, perfectly accurate internet. This means that faster Tem are usually going to swing first. Your higher level Tem is usually going to swing first. But as you compare different techniques, if you swing with a slower technique, that lower level Tem that's choosing a higher priority technique may get to swing first. When you're looking at matchups where you think that your Tem's going to get knocked out that turn, or you think that you have a chance to double or quadruple damage them, and they have a chance to double and quadruple you, the order can really determine the outcome of the battle. And so understanding how priority factors in will help you know when you can afford to use a lower priority technique or when you should use that high priority technique to hit that guy that just has a little bit of health left, to go ahead, and if you can beat them to the punch, they don't get to take that turn because they're knocked out. And from here, we're going to talk about the three parts of what stats are. So you have your effective stat over here, and it's being calculated by three things. The first is the actual stat. So over in the Tempedia, you notice that every Tem has a different base stats. These don't all add up to the same number. Some Tems are more powerful than others. Oshiara, the water ice pony, is the highest with 486 right now. All the starters are about the same, and many times you'll see a weak Tem is only weak because they're going to evolve into a stronger Tem. So, look at their full evolution if you're ever planning out a team with this, and this is going to determine basically like certain Tems are just faster than other Tems inherently, and certain Tems might be stronger or more defensive or whatever. So that's what gives each Tem its kind of stat personality. Now, your Tem, of course, is a unique iteration of that. And so yours is going to be factored by these two other things. The first is single value, your SVs. This is their genetic quality in this stat. And every genetic quality can be rated on a score from 1 to 50. If it's 50, it'll glow in blue. That means it's a perfect stat. And I've never caught one with more than 2. In theory, they can be 4. I've seen a handful of items that modify SVs in games, but I haven't seen anything that I can go buy from a vendor. So catching one with really good SVs or planning on breeding to one with really good SVs is kind of your best bet to control these. You can't breed to increase better than either parents. We'll talk more about breeding later. So really you want, if you're catching them for breeding, you want that perfect 50. And you kind of want to get that in every stat. You can get all 7 through breeding. So that is possible. Now, shinies, also called Lumas, always come with 2 or more on them. And so just know that when you see shinies, they have at least 2. But when you get into high-end content, people can breed up well beyond that. They can breed to a perfect 7. So just know more stats in your SVs is better. Now, the next thing is TVs, and this is your training value. Every time you battle or catch a certain Tem, it might have yield TVs. You can see this in your Tempedia, and that's what's going to grant those TVs to any Tem that gained experience in that battle, is how the wiki says this works. I haven't gone out and tried to farm these up. I've also noted that it feels like Tems, every time they level, they gain TVs, but ultimately, this number is what's being driven up as you train, as you battle, as you use your Tem. There is a fruit vendor in the second zone where you can buy fruit to drive these numbers up or drive these numbers down. And, you might want to drive them down, especially once you've hit cap and you're starting to work at building your stats beyond level cap. Current level cap in early access is level 48, but I assume that's going to go up as they add more content, and they just restricted it so that we aren't God mode when they add the next zone and the next one and the next ones. Now, TVs become less effective the more you have. So, a guy with 500 isn't getting 500 times what the guy with 1 is. So when I was first getting TVs, I was like, oh, these are additive. It just, every time I get 1 TV, it adds 1 attack. And that's just what it feels like early on. It actually starts to slow down. And the cap on TVs is 1,000 across all stats, which is why you might want to sometimes reduce stats, because you may want to pull it out of one to shove it into another. And the highest you can drive any one is 500. And so that's kind of how stats work. That's what's all factoring into that. There's a big equation and stuff out there, but just know that TVs is what you control, SVs is what you were given, and then every TEM, of course, has its baseline that's all modifying. So an inherently faster TEM is an inherently faster TEM, just because, even if they have the same SVs and TVs as a slower TEM. Now, we can talk about trait. Traits are something that every TEM has one of, but they don't really get it from breeding. It's random. It's just dealt to them. So even when I breed two TEMs that have identical traits, the child is not guaranteed that trait unless I use an item to kind of force that. So it randomly determines. Some TEMs only have one available to them. It's determined by evolutionary line. So, of course, randomly one of one, it's always the same. Most have two. So when you're out fighting them, if you feel like one is behaving a little differently, like there's these Spriols that have an ability called Camaraderie, which means that if there's a TEM of the same type out, they'll take half damage. And so when they appear in a pair, it feels like they just don't die, and that's because they have camaraderie. But one might die really easy and the other might not, and that's because one has camaraderie and one doesn't. So understanding what those are, what different TEMs can have, and things like that will help you understand what the stats are doing, because you can't actually see their trait. You would just have to know it inherently. Up in the top, there's this little tree bush thing. That's fertility. Don't worry about that until you're getting into breeding and stuff. And then there's a gear slot that's going to let you equip gear. Now, as you adventure, you're going to get different gear at different points. And these can range from everything like it increases the chance of you catching, or it forces them to target you, or it makes you immune to certain effects, or resist certain types of damage. It can even, there's one called a Coward's Cloak that allows them to get experience even if they weren't in the battle. So you can have that guy sit down at the bottom of your team in the weak slot, and that Coward's Cloak, which is what it's called, can let you level up that lower level TEM free of risk of getting one shot by actually having to put them out on the battlefield. So there's a ton of these. The lore is one of my favorites because I can go into an area where I have a TEM that I know all the attacks in that area tend to be weak against it. I can put a lore on it. That makes the untamed TEMs have to target it. And then that gives me a lot of freedom to know that I'm just taking half damage, so I can focus on catching or whatever I want to do because I've got my guy here that's just tanking the crap out of it. So equipping the right gear can really help. It can even offset like a weakness or something like that. Now, with all of that, you now understand how to read what a TEM is doing, and you understand how that's affecting combat. Once you understand all that, combat's very simple. You're going to start with 6. You want to deploy them in the number that you would use them, because if your first and your second one go down, then the next combat you're in, you're going to see that number 3 and number 4 as your starters. So put them in the order you want them, and then every round, it's going to be down to a simple order of events. First, all the trainers are going to select a task, or the untrained TEM or whatever. So if you're dueling somebody, I'm going to pick my tasks, you're going to pick your task, and that's all going to happen. Items and swapping are really high priority, so like I've always seen them go off first. In theory, there are techniques that can beat it. I've never seen that happen. And then it's just going to work its way down the list. Speed times priority. It's going to put everybody in order, and you're all going to go down the list. It's going to go all the way through combat. And so at the very end, if anybody has poisons or overexerted, they're all going to take their damage. And that's going to be the end of the round. At the end of the round, any TEMs that died are going to yield experience to the TEMs that have seen them in battle at any point. And assuming those TEMs are still alive. And so that's going to kind of determine that round. That means you can level up in the middle of a fight. That means you can evolve in the middle of a fight. Evolution is always a good thing here, so there's no reason for them to allow you to decline evolution. It's always just bonus stats. It's just better. You want to evolve. You can even gain new techniques in the middle of combat. It'll give you the option to swap them in. If you don't want to, just push B or whatever the escape and just skip that. You can always add it back later. If you swap it, realize you hate it, you can always add it back later. No big deal. And so that's the end of one round. And basically, that's going to happen round after round after round after round. If at any point you lose a TEM, at the end of that round, you're going to have a chance to put another TEM out before the next combat round starts, which will give that TEM the ability to come out and like not just have to stand around for a turn. The battle ends when one of the sides is out of TEMs. So if you're going against a solo Tem, ends pretty quickly. If you're going against a trainer that has 6, if it's you against a buddy and you both have 6, it can last several rounds as you slowly kind of beat that down. Overexerting, it will let you finish off your own Tem. There's a trait to resist that, but for most Tems, overexerting can and will kill you. So just be careful overexerting. Because it doesn't really confirm. It shows you kind of blinking, hey, I'm going to use all your stamina and this much of your life. But just have a plan. There are times that I feel like I'm going to die that turn anyway, so I overexert intentionally or to finish you off or whatever. But just make sure that you know that everything that's going to happen as a result of you hitting that ability is what you wanted to happen. There are times it's worth it, and there are, I think, 7 Tems that can have that trait. Know your plan. Every technique will do damage based on the technique and then modified by your stats. So when you see 2 Tem that both have, like, let's say a 10 stamina ability that hits for 40 damage, that 40 damage may hit harder because the higher level Tem has more stats than the lower level Tem, or however TV is factored into that. In some cases, the lower level Tem uses all their stamina and still doesn't hit as hard. And that's before we even talk about like double and quadruple and all that mess. Then you modify that even further. So quadruple is just a crazy multiplier. It very rarely happens, but when it does, you just feel so awesome as long as you're the one doing quadruple damage. Now, with all this knowledge, you can go out there and you can battle all the trainers, you can battle all the wilds. Wilds tend to be weaker than the trainers that surround them as a general rule. So be sure to go out there and try all this out. Get used to how all the different things work, build your team accordingly, and get used to kind of swing for advantage. There is a little circle that appears. It's green if you're strong against it, red if it's weak. That only appears if you've caught that Tem before. So it can't just be something you've seen, it has to be something you've caught. So that's the advantage of catching one of everything, and that does include evolutions. So if I have the base level of a Tem, but I don't have that second or possibly third evolution, the moment I come across something that's already in one of those evolved states, I might know in my head, just because its odds are it's pretty similar weaknesses to the baby, assuming that like there's not a type change there. But it's not gonna clue you in. So with that, guys, that's really it. My name's Chris with Work to Game. This is the second of a multi-part series here on Temtem, and then I'm gonna put them all in a big long one for you together. So thank you so much for hanging out. I hope you guys are enjoying Temtem, and I'll see you next time.